There is belief, and then there is skepticism. And between those two lies a vast territory of questions and the unknown. But what if reality is far more complex than we've been willing to perceive? And what if the stories that we dismissed as myth and legend hold the keys to understanding consciousness? From ghostly encounters to mysterious lights in the sky, humanity has always sensed there was something more out there. Some call it the paranormal, and others call it the divine. Some search the stars for answers, while others look within. They are all connected, threads in the grand tapestry of life. But we stand at a place where the fabric between realities is much thinner than you might think, because this is Crossroads of the Veil. We traveled through the shadows where the world we know frays at the edges, and the truly unexplainable begins to bleed through. Tonight our journey pulls us from the predictable glow of cityscapes, plunging us deep into the seething green heart of the Amazon jungle. We're not just visiting a place, we're descending into a time when the sky itself became a malevolent entity, turning against a small, unsuspecting community with a focused and terrible intelligence. We are bound for a small fishing island, a speck of land named Colares, which for a few months became the unwilling epicenter of one of the most intense, violent, and officially documented UFO sieges in modern history. This isn't a story you've heard 1,000 times. This is not about faint, fuzzy lights glimpsed from a safe distance, or a shaky video that could be anything. This is the story of a siege, a relentless, methodical, and horrifying assault from an unknown and unknowable enemy. It is a story of documented physical violations, of medical nightmares that baffled doctors and left permanent weeping scars, and of a government conspiracy so profound its secrets are still being painstakingly exhumed from their classified graves decades later. We're talking about an event so deeply strange, so fundamentally terrifying, that the local people gave it a name they would only whisper. Chupa Chupa, a name that translates to the sucker. It's a deceptively childish name for a horror that was anything but. Join me as we deconstruct the puzzle of Colares, Brazil. We'll unearth military files once branded top secret, documents never meant for our eyes. We'll recount the harrowing first-hand accounts of witnesses whose lives were forever fractured. And we will expose the chilling deathbed confession of the man the government sent to investigate, the man who was supposed to prove it was all a lie, but who instead found a truth more shocking than anyone could have possibly imagined. What descended upon that isolated island was not from our known world, and the fear it left behind was profoundly terrifying. Night falls over Colares as it always does near the Earth's equator. There is no gentle, lingering twilight in this part of the world. One moment the sun is a blistering disk, and the next it plunges below the horizon, and a blackness rushes in to take its place. Colares was a forgotten island of fishermen and their families, a community tucked away in the vast river delta, where the Amazon heaves itself into the Atlantic. It was a place governed by the primeval rhythms of water and sky. For generations, this sudden darkness was a welcome, familiar friend. It signaled the end of a punishing workday. The heavy, sticky air of the rainforest would cool, offering a bit of relief. The chaotic symphony of the daytime jungle, the shriek of monkeys, the cacophony of birds, the ceaseless drone of insects would soften into a steady, nocturnal lullaby, and the sky was a spectacle. With no city lights to bleach its canvas, the night revealed its glory. A breathtaking, glittering shroud of stars stretched from one end of the world to the other. It was a time for rest, for family gatherings on simple wooden porches, for the quiet storytelling that island life affords. The darkness wasn't an enemy, it was a comforting blanket. But in the latter half of 1977, this ancient rhythm was not just disturbed, it was shattered. The darkness no longer brought comfort. It began to bring a new and profound terror that seeped into the very soil of the island, poisoning the roots of their reality. Nights were no longer for rest, but for tense, nerve-shredding vigils. Families no longer sat outside, they huddled inside their homes, peering through the cracks in wooden shutters like prisoners in a cell. The air grew thick with a constant, biting fear. and the unfamiliar, acrid smell of wood smoke from huge bonfires lit along the shore. These fires weren't for warmth, they were desperate, primitive shields against the sky. They were a fragile defense against an enemy they knew was watching from above. Their flickering orange light pushed back against a darkness that now held a malevolent, calculating intelligence. The entire community held its breath night after night, waiting for the lights to come again. For the people of Colares, the threat was from above. It was a silent, insidious invasion. It began with a strange light, or sometimes a procession of them. These were not planets or stars. They came in all shapes and sizes, glowing, silent spheres moving with fluid, predatory grace. Some shaped like umbrellas, hideously wide at the top and narrow at the bottom. Others long and thin like giant phosphorescent cigars floating in the void. These were not shooting stars or distant airplanes with their predictable blinking lights and droning engines. These objects moved with an unnatural, tomb-like silence and an impossible, breathtaking speed. One moment they would be loitering just feet above the swaying treetops, perfectly still. The next they would rip a hole in the blackness in the blink of an eye, leaving no sound, no trail, nothing but a lingering stain of awe and terror. They seemed to possess a purpose, an intelligence that was both undeniable and terrifyingly alien. They weren't wandering, they were observing. They were scouting. They were hunting. At first, a nervous curiosity rippled through the town. In the marketplace, women shared hushed stories while buying fish. Fishermen on the water would point at the sky, their nets forgotten. Children drew strange, alien shapes in the dirt, trying to replicate the impossible things they had seen. But the time for wonder was brutally short. Within weeks, mystery turned into menace. Soon the lights began to descend. The deep primal fear that shatters a community forever began when the light started to focus on the islanders, picking them out one by one with unnerving precision, like a predator isolating its prey from the herd. The strange lights were no longer something to be watched. They became an active aggressor, physically violating people in their homes and on their streets. Witnesses, their voices trembling with the remembered horror, said the objects fired powerful focused beams of light that struck with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't like a flashlight beam. It felt solid, heavy. Victims described a terrifying systematic violation that happened in stages. First, they felt a crushing weight pressing down, an invisible pressure that stole the air from their lungs, making it impossible to breathe. Then came a searing heat where the beam made contact, a sharp, focused pain like a white-hot poker being pressed against their skin. After that came the most horrifying part of the ordeal, a sudden, terrifying paralysis. They lost all control of their muscles, their limbs turning to lead, leaving them frozen. A conscious mind trapped in a dead body. They were awake and aware of everything, seeing, hearing, and feeling the terror unfold, but they couldn't move a muscle. They would try to scream, to warn their families, but no sound would emerge. Their very voices were stolen. They were entombed within their own bodies, silent, helpless witnesses to their own assault. The community, caught in a near-mass panic, fought back with what little they had. Men organized nightly watches, gathering in small, grim-faced groups, standing guard on the beaches with their machetes and old hunting rifles. These simple weapons offered a sliver of comfort and a small illusion of control, but they were useless against a silent, luminous enemy. What good is a rifle against a beam of light? Every now and then, the tense silence would be shattered by the pop and flash of fireworks. It wasn't a celebration. It was a panicked attempt to scare away the silent hunters. Each explosion that lit the sky was a desperate prayer, a defiant scream into the watching darkness, a brave but futile gesture against an enemy they could not possibly comprehend. It was a siege by an unknown force, an experience that would be burned forever into the annals of the unexplained, leaving a forgotten Brazilian island as a permanent, chilling reminder of a time when the sky itself became something to fear. In the long, strange history of unidentified aerial phenomena, few cases are as bizarre and as rich with physical evidence, or as deeply entwined with government cover-up as the events that plagued the Brazilian state of Para in 1977. This was not a fleeting light in the sky, questioned moments after it was seen. It wasn't a blurry photo or a single wild story easily dismissed by a smug debunker. This was a sustained wave of encounters, an infestation, stretching over many months and across a wide geographical area. And most importantly, it had real measurable physical effects. It terrorized a population of thousands. It confounded doctors with injuries they had never seen before, and it forced the Brazilian military to launch a secret, high-level investigation into the heart of the darkness. This incident, known as the Colares flap, is a breed apart from most UFO cases. Its significance rests on three unshakable pillars of evidence. These aren't just stories, they are cold, hard facts. Together, they construct a case that is incredibly strong, deeply disturbing, and almost impossible to dismiss as mere folklore. The first pillar is the overwhelming number of eyewitnesses and the shocking consistency of their accounts. The events didn't happen to a few suggestible people. Hundreds, and some reports claim over 1,000, were directly affected across dozens of towns and villages in the Amazon Delta. These witnesses, spread over a large area with no means of rapid communication, all provided a consistent baseline of observation. Their stories, collected by journalists, concerned doctors, and later official military investigators, all agreed on the critical, horrifying details. They described the varied appearance of the objects, from small glowing orbs to giant coffin-like cylinders. They described their impossible flight dynamics, hovering in absolute silence before accelerating to impossible speeds. And most chillingly, they all described the hostile interactions. Beams of light that caused real physical harm. That so many unconnected people describe the same unbelievable things points not to a shared delusion, but to a single shared, horrific reality. It wasn't a story spreading, it was an epidemic of sightings. The second pillar, and perhaps the most scientifically damning, is the undeniable medical evidence of physical injuries. The claims of being attacked by light beams were not imagined. The violations left real, visible, and documented marks upon the flesh. These injuries were meticulously recorded by the head of the local health clinic, a dedicated and courageous doctor. She personally treated dozens of patients who stumbled into her clinic bearing the same strange and alarming symptoms. Her medical records detail burn-like lesions with bizarre, tiny puncture holes in the center, mysterious hair loss in the affected areas, and patches of skin that were rapidly dying and turning black, a condition known as necrosis. Blood tests revealed a sudden, inexplicable drop in red blood cells, anemia, which left them weak, dizzy, and drained of life. Dr. Carvalho's methodical records provide a rare and valuable glimpse into the physical, biological dimension of these encounters. They ground the unbelievable stories in the hard, cold reality of medical science. This proof makes it impossible for anyone to claim it was all in their heads. Hysteria doesn't leave necrotic scars. Panic doesn't cause skin to die or blood counts to plummet. The third, and in many ways most crucial, is the direct involvement of a special military intelligence group from the Brazilian Air Force. This wasn't a local police officer taking a cursory look. This was a formal, top-secret mission with its own code name. The military was taking the possibility of non-human craft seriously from the very beginning. The operation was commanded by a highly respected military captain, and a team of trained observers, experts in surveillance, was deployed into the area for months. This team didn't just investigate local stories, they soon became first-hand witnesses, seeing and recording their own terrifying encounters with these objects. They took hundreds of professional photographs and hours of motion picture film of the very phenomena they had been sent to debunk. This direct military involvement provides a level of official confirmation almost unheard of in the shadowy world of ufology. It elevates the case from a local mystery to a matter of national security, officially documented by the government. The military's own secret data confirmed the phenomenon was real, structured, and intelligently controlled, even as their official public statement would later deny everything. It is this massive, unexplainable chasm between the terrifying evidence they secretly collected and the government's public statement that nothing unusual had happened that lies at the cold black heart of the Colares mystery. Why would they lie? What were they trying to hide? To even begin to comprehend the information surrounding the Colares incident, we must peer at it through different lenses. Each perspective offers a potential explanation for the same set of incredible facts. The chorus of consistent witness testimonies, the medically recorded physical violations, and the secretive and deceptive actions of the Brazilian government. Three main possibilities have been debated in hushed tones for years. First is the extraterrestrial or interdimensional hypothesis. This is the most shocking and reality-bending perspective, suggesting the phenomena were manifestations of a non-human intelligence. This concept has two main branches. One, the most common UFO theory, posits that beings traveled from other planets across the vast emptiness of space to visit Earth. The other, a far more unsettling version, suggests they bled through from other dimensions or parallel worlds that exist alongside, or perhaps within our own. The evidence supporting this is centered on the advanced, and frankly impossible, flight characteristics of the objects. They could hover in absolute silence, without any visible means of propulsion. They could execute instantaneous, razor-sharp turns that would liquefy any human pilot. They could accelerate to incredible velocities in a heartbeat without producing a sonic boom. And according to the military's own reports, they could travel seamlessly through both air and water, plunging into the depths of the bay as easily as they soared through the sky. These movements are a mockery of our known technology, not just in 1977, but even today. The craft's apparent purpose and calculating intelligence also fit this model. They weren't random lights. They seemed to be conducting a careful, systematic survey of the area. They specifically targeted people with beams of light in a methodical, almost clinical fashion. On top of this, some witnesses claim to have seen strange, humanoid-looking beings inside or near the craft. The most credible report of this kind came from the military's lead investigator himself, Captain Hollanda, a man whose entire career was built on objective observation. This theory, while stunning, suggests the events might be far more complex than just visitors from another world. The second perspective is the psychosocial hypothesis. This lens attempts to explain the Colares events using known concepts from psychology and sociology, without resorting to an external cause like aliens. This idea doesn't necessarily claim the hundreds of witnesses were lying. That would be a statistical impossibility. Instead, it suggests their very real experiences can be explained by our understanding of the human mind and group behavior under extreme stress. The primary explanation here is mass psychogenic illness, more commonly known as mass hysteria. This theory posits that a perfect storm of factors, pre-existing local beliefs in spirits and folklore, coupled with the endemic anxiety of living in a poor, isolated community, could have created a contagion of fear. This potent combination of belief and stress could have led to a wave of very real physical symptoms generated by the mind. People might have mistaken mundane phenomena in the sky, ball lightning, bright planets, or even conventional aircraft seen under unusual atmospheric conditions, for something threatening. Once a few influential people reported something terrifying, the fear could have spread like a virus, causing others to see and feel the same things. The official and utterly false conclusion from the Brazilian Air Force, which stated that no unusual phenomena were observed, seems to buttress this more mundane view. It suggests what people saw did not require an extraordinary explanation. It was all just a tragic, widespread misunderstanding. The third framework offers a shadowy middle ground between aliens and mass hysteria. The terrestrial secrecy hypothesis. This theory proposes that the objects over Colares were not from another world, but were in fact advanced, top-secret human technology. This idea is heavily influenced by the time period, 1977, the absolute zenith of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. These two superpowers were locked in a desperate struggle for global dominance, and a huge part of that clandestine war was the development of secret next-generation technologies. A remote, sparsely populated area like the Amazon Delta, with almost no electronic monitoring, would be the perfect secret testing ground for new experimental aircraft. These could have been advanced spy drones, silent and capable of hovering. They could have been experimental directed energy weapons designed to sow psychological terror in an enemy population. Under this theory, the Brazilian government's extreme secrecy makes perfect logical sense. They might not have been covering up alien contact. Instead, they might have been profoundly embarrassed and alarmed that they couldn't identify or control advanced military technology from another country, likely the United States, operating with impunity in their airspace and even harming their own citizens. This idea provides a logical, real-world reason for both the reality of the events, because the objects were real machines, and the official cover-up that followed. It reframes the incident not as a paranormal event, but as a forgotten, terrifying chapter in the shadowy history of Cold War espionage. So, which of these frameworks best fits the blood-soaked facts? Was it an invasion from the stars, a sickness that spread through the minds of a terrified populace, or a secret war fought in the dark skies over a forgotten island? The evidence, what little has been allowed to see the light of day, will be our only guide as we dig deeper into the heart of this Amazonian mystery. The horrifying events that brought the Brazilian military to the besieged island of Colares did not begin there. To understand the true scale of the horror, one must zoom out. To focus only on Colares is to miss the larger, more disturbing picture that elevates this from a local mystery into a massive regional event of unprecedented size and malevolence. The siege of Colares was not the beginning, it was the final, terrifying climax of a much larger wave of anomalous objects that had been growing in intensity and moving with a cold purpose for months. It was a slow-moving tide of light and fear, creeping inexorably across the Brazilian landscape. History and declassified records show the phenomenon first began to manifest hundreds of miles east of Colares, in the neighboring state of Maranhão, as early as April 1977. In this first phase, the encounters were less overtly aggressive but were still deeply strange. Numerous sightings of bright, silent objects were reported by people in remote rural communities. These were often simple, hard-working people, many of whom were illiterate, whose lives were intimately connected to the land and the sky. Initially, local authorities dismissed these reports as the fanciful tales of an uneducated populace, chalking them up to misidentifications of weather balloons or bright stars, or simply the product of local superstition. But as the weeks bled into months, the reports grew in number. The stories became more consistent, more detailed, and far more urgent. People were no longer just curious, they were becoming deeply afraid. Then a clear and disturbing pattern emerged. When investigators mapped the locations of the sightings, they saw something remarkable. The sightings were not random. They were moving steadily, relentlessly westward. This was not a random collection of lights popping up across the region. It was a clear, directional movement, like a slow-motion invasion. The phenomenon seemed to be systematically sweeping over the Gurupi River, the natural border separating the states of Maranhão and Pará. From there, it continued its methodical advance across the northern coast of Pará, creeping closer each week to the city of Belém, the state capital, and the sprawling river delta where the island of Colares lay waiting, oblivious. This deliberate geographical progression is a key and chilling clue. A purely psychological event, like mass hysteria, typically radiates from a single social epicenter, spreading like a rumor through social connection. But the straight, migrating trajectory of the 1977 sightings is far more indicative of actual physical objects moving with a clear purpose across a vast territory. It looked less like a social phenomenon and more like a military maneuver. Captain Hollanda, the lead military investigator, became convinced of this pattern after studying the reports. He would later describe the movement as methodical, almost as if it were programmed by a computer. In a now famous interview, he stated it was as if the objects were covering the Brazilian airspace and the Amazon region in strips, like we do when we take aerial photographs from a plane. This observation strongly suggests a purpose, a systematic survey, or a large-scale scouting mission. One of the most tragic harbingers of the horror to come occurred on a desolate marsh known as Caranguejo Island. 4 fishermen, men who knew the sea and sky like the back of their own hands, reported a terrifying encounter with a bright, fiery object that descended from the sky toward their small, vulnerable boat. The details of what happened next were clouded by their extreme trauma, but the result was tragically clear. The incident led to the death of one of the fishermen, a man named Jose. A medical examiner concluded that he died from a massive stroke brought on by extreme emotional shock. The terror he felt was so absolute, so profound, that it literally stopped his heart. His 2 friends, Aureliano and Firmino, survived but suffered serious injuries that resembled severe burns. This early case, months before the panic in Colares reached its zenith, set a disturbing precedent of direct physical harm that would become the most terrifying feature of the events to come. The Maranhão wave was a critical prologue, proving that the phenomenon was a widespread, mobile, and physically dangerous presence long before it commanded the secret attention of the Brazilian military. By August 1977, the slow-moving wave of lights migrating west across the Brazilian coast began to concentrate its activity with terrifying intensity on the small, isolated island of Colares. This quiet fishing community of only about 2,000 souls, its isolation, its near-total lack of electricity and modern communication, seemed to make it a perfect contained laboratory for whatever cold intelligence guided the lights. For approximately 4 terrifying months from August to December, the people of Colares lived in a state of almost constant nerve-shattering fear. The stories from civilian eyewitnesses during this period are staggering, not merely for their sheer volume, but for their shocking, chilling similarity. Hundreds of residents, from young children to elderly fishermen, came forward with reports to the police, the mayor, and later the military, describing a bewildering menagerie of flying objects that had invaded their night sky. Witnesses described small, bright spheres or orbs, which often moved in tight, intelligent formations. They also reported larger, darker, cylinder-shaped or coffin-shaped craft that moved with a deathly silence. But most commonly, they described objects that resembled a glowing umbrella or a classic disc-shaped saucer. These umbrella objects, which often possessed a brilliant light on top, seemed to be the primary craft involved in the aggressive assaults on the population. These objects were not distant dots of light. They flew at extremely low altitudes, often hovering just feet above the jungle canopy or the simple clay tile roofs of their homes. Their proximity was a key component of their terror. They were right there, impossible to ignore, loitering with an alien intent. They moved with a creepy, unnatural silence, sometimes broken by a low, vibrating hum, a sound many described as being like an electrical transformer. This silence was deeply unsettling. An object of that size, hovering so steadily, should have produced a deafening roar like a helicopter. Instead, there was an eerie quiet that only amplified the fear. It was a flagrant violation of the known laws of physics. The craft displayed impossible flight capabilities. They could hover perfectly still for minutes on end, as if suspended from an invisible string. They could execute instantaneous 90-degree turns without decelerating, and they could accelerate to incredible speeds in a fraction of a second, vanishing from sight without a sonic boom. The community's reaction to this nightly invasion evolved through stages, from curiosity to fear, and finally to organized, desperate self-defense. As the encounters morphed from mere sightings to direct physical violations, the islanders organized nightly patrols. They were fishermen, not soldiers, but they did what they had to do to protect their families. Believing the lights were evil spirits, demons from the sky, they fought back with a raw primal desperation. They lit huge bonfires on the beaches every single night, hoping the smoke and flames would either scare the lights away or obscure the village from their sight. It was a primitive defense against a futuristic, incomprehensible enemy. The constant crackling of these fires became the new grim soundtrack of the Colares nights. The sound of fireworks often shattered the tense calm, another desperate attempt to frighten the silent intruders. Each explosion was a small, defiant scream into the void. The fear was palpable, and it had devastating consequences. The normal life of the community began to disintegrate. A partial exodus occurred as many people packed what little they owned and fled. Many women and children were sent away by their husbands and fathers, put on boats to stay with relatives on the safer mainland. The men, meanwhile, stayed behind to protect their homes. Night became a time of fearful, sleepless watching, while the day was for exhausted, anxious sleep. The sheer number of witnesses and the overwhelming consistency of their descriptions created a public health crisis that local authorities could no longer ignore or explain away. They were facing an invasion, and they were losing. What transformed the Colares Flat from a frightening series of sightings into a full-blown medical and social crisis was the brutal reality of the physical attacks. This wasn't just about being scared by strange lights in the sky. This was about being physically violated by them. The locals gave this phenomenon a chillingly descriptive name, chupa chupa, This name, meaning sucker sucker or simply the sucker in Portuguese, arose from the widespread, terrifying belief that the powerful beams of light were somehow sucking out blood or some essential life energy from their victims. While this might sound like a primitive folktale, a clinical examination of the documented attacks reveals a consistent, specific, and medically verified pattern of injury. This was not a product of overactive imaginations. The attacks almost invariably began with a focused, targeted beam of light. This was not a soft glow or a sweeping searchlight. Witnesses in hundreds of separate accounts described this beam in a remarkably similar way. They said it was about 3 inches in diameter, intensely bright, almost blinding, and often a brilliant white or bluish white. The beam acted like a targeted weapon. It would hit them suddenly, often catching them by surprise inside their own homes, shining with impossible ease through thin wooden walls or straw roofs. Many reported that the beam would follow them as they tried to run, tracking their movements with perfect predatory accuracy before it struck. It was intelligent. When hit, victims reported the same crippling sequence of effects over and over again. The first sensation was a deep, instantaneous paralysis, rendering them unable to move or scream. Simultaneously, they felt an intense, focused heat, a pain they described as almost as hot as a cigarette burn at the point of impact. Many also felt a heavy weight pushed against their chest, an invisible pressure that made breathing incredibly difficult, as if a large man were standing on them. The medical evidence provides the crucial, undeniable anchor to these terrifying stories. Dr. Carvalho, the head of the Colares Health Clinic, personally treated around 80 people who claimed they had been struck by these beams. She was not a UFO believer. She was a doctor confronted with a frightening medical mystery that was harming her community, and it was her sworn duty to help. Personally treated around 80 people who claimed they had been struck by these beams. She was not a UFO believer. She was a doctor confronted with a frightening medical mystery that was harming her community, and it was her sworn duty to help. Dr. Carvalho, through her careful examination of dozens of patients, noticed a consistent and alarming pattern of physical marks, which she herself stated looked like radiation injuries. The injury process began with the skin in the affected area, usually the face, neck, or chest, turning intensely red. This was followed by alopecia, or hair loss. In that specific area, the hair would fall out in clumps and often never grew back. Most remarkably, the skin would then turn black, a sign of necrosis, meaning the tissue was dead. Dr. Carvalho noted something medically bizarre about these marks. Unlike normal burns, where skin dies slowly over hours or days, these lesions showed that the skin had died almost instantaneously, turning black and leathery within minutes of the attack. Even more disturbing, when she looked closely at the dead tissue, she saw small, clear puncture marks in the center of the lesions, often in pairs like a tiny, precise snakebite. These tiny surgical wounds, which looked as if they were made by a thin needle, gave a chilling reality to the name Chupa Chupa. It looked for all the world as if something had been inserted into the skin to extract something. Blood tests performed on the victims revealed another alarming pattern, a significant decrease in hemoglobin levels. This meant they were suddenly and severely anemic, with a dangerously low red blood cell count. As a result, victims complained of long periods of extreme weakness, dizziness, chronic headaches, and a complete lack of energy. Some were so weak they were unable to walk for days or even weeks after an attack. Tragically, 2 of Dr. Carvalho's patients, who were sent to a larger hospital in Belém, later died from their mysterious symptoms. Dr. Carvalho was adamant in her professional opinion. She resisted intense pressure from the Air Force investigators, who wanted her to dismiss the cases as collective hysteria. She bravely argued that nobody can have the same delirium, the same visual, sonic, and synthetic hallucination at the same time and in different places. The specific, repeatable, and medically documented nature of these injuries makes a purely psychological explanation seem utterly impossible. Instead, it points directly toward an unknown physical agent, a form of advanced, targeted, directed energy technology we still do not fully comprehend. By October 1977, the situation in Colares had degenerated into a full-blown public safety crisis. The nightly visitations of the Chupa Chupa and the growing number of people with inexplicable physical injuries had created a state of collective panic that the local government was powerless to contain. The mayor and the small, overwhelmed police force were terrified themselves. The very fabric of the community was beginning to unravel. The local economy, which depended on fishermen going out at night, was grinding to a halt because the men were too terrified to be on the water after dark. No one dared to be outside when the sun went down. As the fear spread like a contagion and the danger became undeniable, a large number of the island's women and children were evacuated by their families. They were sent on boats to the relative safety of the mainland, to stay with relatives until the terror passed. This was not a simple precaution, it was a desperate flight, an admission that their home was no longer safe. This complete breakdown of normal life forced the mayor of Colares to take an unprecedented step. Realizing this phenomenon was far beyond his small town's ability to handle, Mayor Soeiro officially requested direct military intervention from the Brazilian Air Force. He sent an urgent dispatch to the 1st Regional Air Command, a major military base in the nearby city of Belém. This official request for military intervention is a critical turning point in the story. It irrevocably moves the incident from the realm of folklore and rumor into the category of a documented national security event. The military's involvement was not a proactive research project, it was a reactive mission, a response to a clear and present danger. It was launched in response to a real and ongoing threat to the safety, health, and security of Brazilian citizens. The government was finally forced to act, not just to restore order, but to confront an unknown intruder that was violating its sovereign airspace and actively harming its people. In response to Mayor Soeiro's desperate plea, 1st Regional Air Command launched a top-secret intelligence mission codenamed Operation Saucer. The codename itself is a fascinating and telling clue. It shows that from the very beginning, the highest echelons of the Air Force were seriously considering the possibility that they were dealing with the classic flying saucer phenomenon. The operation was active for approximately 4 intense months, from October to December 1977. The critical role of operational chief was assigned to Captain Hollanda. The choice of Hollanda was significant. He was not a desk officer. He was an experienced and highly respected intelligence agent for the A2, the secret intelligence branch of the Brazilian Air Force. He was also a commander of the elite Parasar parachute search and rescue team. Hollanda was a serious, tough, practical, and highly disciplined military officer, not a man prone to flights of fancy. By his own admission, made years later, he was deeply skeptical of the reports when first assigned the mission. He initially believed the phenomenon was likely secret guerrilla activity, or more probably, a classic case of mass hysteria among a superstitious population. He went to Colares to debunk the stories, not to confirm them. Hollanda's team was small but highly specialized, consisting of himself and about 6 sergeants. Their methodology was that of a classic field intelligence gathering operation. During the day, they fanned out across the region, not just on Colares, but to about 30 other villages that had reported sightings. They conducted formal interviews with hundreds of witnesses, documenting their stories, drawing detailed sketches of what people saw, and creating complex maps to track the flight paths of the strange objects. At night, the team's mission shifted to active surveillance. They established hidden observation posts in strategic locations with a wide, unobstructed view of the area. One of their most important posts was at a place on the coast called Sun Bay. From there, they conducted all-night vigils, night after excruciating night. They were not armed with conventional weapons. They were armed with a sophisticated suite of data collection tools, high-powered cameras with enormous telephoto lenses, motion picture cameras, and theodolites for accurately measuring the angles, altitude, speed, and flight paths of the objects. The sheer volume of data they collected was immense. Over several months, Hollanda's team amassed a huge and incredibly detailed archive. The final written report submitted to his superiors was said to contain between 500 and 2,000 pages of documents, interviews, and analysis. Most importantly, the team captured a massive trove of primary hard evidence. Over 500 high-quality photographs and approximately 16 hours of motion picture film of the strange luminous objects that were terrorizing the region. This collection of officially gathered military-grade data represents one of the largest and most credible archives of evidence related to a UAP flap ever assembled by any government in the world, and almost all of it remains hidden from the public to this very day. An extraordinary thing happened during Operation Saucer that completely changed the nature of the investigation. The military team, the men sent to explain away a phenomenon reported by civilians, became primary first-hand witnesses themselves. The professional skepticism Captain Hollanda and his men brought to Colares rapidly and completely evaporated when they were confronted with their own direct, repeated, and undeniable sightings. This dramatic transformation from detached observers to amazed and sometimes terrified participants is documented in the official reports they filed. It turned their mission from a simple investigation into a direct confrontation with the unknown. Their own eyes told them that something incredible and terrifying was happening. The declassified documents contain numerous detailed entries where the military agents themselves report seeing, photographing, and filming the luminous bodies. Their language is precise, technical, and professional, which only serves to make their descriptions more powerful. They recorded objects of various shapes and colors performing incredible maneuvers impossible for any known aircraft of that era. In one report, the team photographed an object that changed color from a dull yellow-red to a brilliant white-blue. They noted in their log that it spun on its vertical axis like a spinning top before it shot straight up into the sky at unbelievable speed, vanishing in less than a second. Captain Hollanda himself later described a personal sighting that was seared into his memory forever. While he and his team were stationed at their observation post in Sun Bay, they saw a massive, dark, disc-shaped object. He estimated it was about 100 feet in diameter, hovering in complete and utter silence just a few hundred feet above them. The craft was so close, so large, and so undeniably real that it left his highly trained, combat-ready men, in his own words, stupefied. They just stood there, mouths agape, cameras in hand, completely frozen in a state of profound awe and terror. It was a moment that shattered their fundamental understanding of reality. Perhaps the most stunning phenomena they witnessed involved what scientists call transmedium activity, the ability of an object to travel through different environments, like air and water, with ease. Several members of the military team, including Captain Hollanda, witnessed and reportedly filmed objects diving into and emerging from the waters of Marajo Bay. They watched as bright lights descended from the sky, entered the water without a splash or a sound, and vanished beneath the dark churning surface. Minutes or hours later, a similar light might be seen silently rising from the water and rejoining the night sky. This bizarre behavior suggested the objects were not just limited to flight. It hinted at the terrifying possibility that they may have had an underwater base or a point of origin hidden deep beneath the bay. The fact that trained, skeptical military observers repeatedly witnessed and documented these events with official equipment lifts the entire Colares phenomenon from a collection of civilian stories to a series of events officially confirmed by credible government witnesses. Their testimony and the massive trove of evidence they collected on film and in photographs stands in stark, screaming opposition to the operation's eventual ridiculous public conclusion. After 4 months of intense investigation and the collection of a massive, priceless archive of evidence, Operation Saucer was suddenly and inexplicably shut down. The order to cease operations did not come because the phenomenon had ended. On the contrary, strange activity was still being reported across the region. Captain Hollanda later revealed in his 1997 interview that the final order to terminate all field operations came directly from his superior, Brigadier General Protasio. The timing of this order is incredibly revealing. It came immediately after Hollanda had submitted his most significant report, the one detailing the close-range encounter with the large 100-foot craft at Sun Bay. The timing suggests the operation was not closed because they lacked evidence. It suggests it was closed because the evidence had become too powerful, too undeniable, and too dangerous to the established worldview. They had found definitive proof of something they couldn't explain or control, and the leaders at the top panicked. What followed was one of the most blatant acts of official misinformation in the history of military UAP investigations. The official conclusion issued by the Brazilian Air Force, the final public word on the months of terror that had gripped Colares, was as brief as it was ludicrous. The investigation, they claimed, had found no unusual phenomena. This official statement is a baffling, insulting paradox. An operation launched in response to a public safety crisis that deployed elite agents into the field for months, whose own agents became first-hand witnesses, and that gathered over 500 professional photographs and 16 hours of film of intelligently controlled objects, was officially declared to have found nothing out of the ordinary. This conclusion was not a misinterpretation, it was a complete and total lie, a statement utterly at odds with the factual record of their own exhaustive investigation. It was a lie, delivered with the full, unblinking authority of the Brazilian government. Following this announcement, the Brazilian government, at the time a military dictatorship highly skilled at controlling information, took decisive steps to bury all information related to the operation. The entire archive, the thousands of pages of reports, the hundreds of priceless photographs, the hours of one-of-a-kind film footage, was classified as top secret and locked away in a military vault. For nearly 20 years, the full story of what the Brazilian Air Force found in the Amazon remained hidden behind an unbreakable wall of official secrecy. This act of classification, when contrasted with the dismissive official conclusion, is the key to understanding the government's true position. If the investigation had truly found nothing unusual, there would be no reason to classify anything. There would be nothing to hide. The decision to classify the archive implies the exact opposite of what they said publicly. It means the government had found something incredibly important, with vast and terrifying implications for national security, and something that it could neither explain nor control. The public statement of no unusual phenomena was therefore not a conclusion based on evidence, but a deliberate cover story, designed to hide a truth the authorities believed was too disruptive and too terrifying to ever reveal. The abrupt closing of Operation Saucer in early 1978 initiated a period of nearly 20 years of absolute government silence. The menacing lights over Colares faded from the headlines, and the terrifying experience of the islanders became local legend, a chilling ghost story whispered in Amazonian villages, but largely forgotten by the outside world. But within the community of dedicated UFO researchers, the Colares incident became the stuff of legend, a holy grail of cases, a frustrating puzzle kept alive by leaked documents and the tireless work of a small group of investigators in Brazil. This wall of silence finally began to crack in the early 2000s. It didn't happen because the government had a sudden change of heart. It happened as a direct result of a determined and relentless campaign for disclosure, led not by politicians, but by ordinary civilians. At the forefront of this movement was the Brazilian Commission of Ufologists, spearheaded by the tireless researcher Ademar José Gueverde, founder of Brazil's respected UFO magazine. In 2004, the Brazilian Commission of Ufologists launched a powerful public campaign with a catchy and demanding title, UFO's Freedom of Information Now. This was a smart, well-organized strategy that used public pressure, media attention, and the legal system to force the Brazilian armed forces to declassify their secret UFO files. They argued correctly that this information, collected by the government and paid for by taxpayers, belonged to the Brazilian people. The campaign was astonishingly successful. In a move that would have been unthinkable just years earlier, in May 2005, a group of ufologists, including Gueverde, was formally invited to the military headquarters in Brasilia. There, they had an unprecedented historic meeting with several high-ranking Air Force generals. During this groundbreaking meeting, military officials admitted for the first time that the Air Force had been systematically tracking and investigating UFOs since 1954. As a sign of goodwill, they allowed the researchers to view a small portion of the secret files, including key documents, official sketches, and a selection of the photographs taken during Operation Saucer. This meeting was a major turning point. Facing both legal and public pressure, the Brazilian Air Force began the slow, grinding process of transferring its vast collection of UFO-related documents to the National Archive in Brasilia, making them publicly available. Today, this astonishing collection contains over 20,000 pages of declassified files, making Brazil one of the most transparent nations regarding its official history with the UAP phenomenon. The unsealing of these archives provided official primary source confirmation for many key elements of the Colares story. The documents confirmed Operation Saucer was real, its timeline, the personnel involved, and its primary mission. However, many researchers believe the most sensitive materials, especially the full, unedited final report by Captain Hollanda and all 16 hours of the motion picture film, are still being withheld by the government, their location a closely guarded secret. The long silence had been broken, but the full, horrifying story had yet to be told. 20 years after Operation Saucer was shuttered and its secrets were entombed, the truth was dramatically dragged into the light by the one man who knew it best. In August 1997, Captain Hollanda, then a retired colonel, made a monumental decision. He could no longer bear the weight of his silence. He contacted ufologists Ademar Jose Gaverd and Marco Antonio Petit and agreed to give a full, on-the-record interview about his unbelievable experiences as the operations commander. This 2-day videotape testimony, given just months before his mysterious death, is arguably the single most important piece of evidence to emerge from the entire Colares case. It provided a detailed, emotional, and damning insider's account that completely shattered the official government story of nothing unusual. It was a captain's confession, a final brave act to set the record straight before it was too late. Hollanda's revelations were stunning. He began by confirming that he and his team had repeatedly seen and documented a wide variety of unidentified aerial phenomena. He described a menagerie of different craft, from small, remote-controlled probes the size of a drone to massive, structured motherships hundreds of feet in diameter. He recounted in vivid, chilling detail the story of the sighting at Sun Bay, where a dark, silent 100-foot-wide disc hovered menacingly just above his team, an event that left his combat-hardened soldiers completely stupefied and speechless. He strongly confirmed the reality of the physical harm inflicted upon the local population, stating unequivocally that the stories of the Chupa Chupa attacks were not fantasy. He had personally interviewed the victims, seen their strange, necrotic injuries, and read Dr. Carvalho's damning medical reports. He believed them completely. Most shockingly, Hollanda went far beyond describing strange craft. He spoke of a personal, direct, close encounter with a non-human being. He described being awoken one night by a bright, paralyzing light that flooded his room. A humanoid figure, about 5 feet tall, then appeared. He said it wore something akin to a metallic protective suit, like a deep-sea diver's pressure suit, with a helmet that completely obscured its face. Hollanda, a trained intelligence officer, found himself completely unable to move, frozen in his bed like an insect pinned to a board. The being approached, and in a gesture he could not comprehend, embraced him. It then communicated with him not by speaking, but telepathically, or through some kind of robotic voice box. It assured him in a calm, neutral, and utterly terrifying tone, "Stay calm, we will not hurt you." This experience left him certain that the phenomena were intelligently controlled by non-human beings engaged in a systematic scouting mission, or more disturbingly, a biological survey of the local people, which would explain the clinical nature of the attacks. Crucially, Hollanda's testimony finally explained the government cover-up. He confirmed the massive amount of evidence his team had collected, specifically mentioning the 500-plus photographs and 16 hours of film. He stated with profound sadness that the most amazing footage his team captured had never been seen again after he turned it into his superiors. The order to shut down the operation, he explained, came directly from his commanding officer immediately after he submitted his report detailing the close-range Sun Bay sighting. This timing strongly suggests the operation was closed, not because they lacked evidence, but because the evidence had become too powerful. Hollanda's confession painted a clear picture of a military and a government that were not skeptical, but were terrified and completely overwhelmed by what they had found lurking in the Amazon. Captain Hollanda's story took a dark and tragic turn just months after he broke his 20-year vow of silence. On October 2, 1997, approximately 3 months after giving his videotaped interview, Colonel Hollanda was found dead in his home. The official cause of death was swiftly ruled a suicide. The report stated he had hanged himself with the belt of his bathrobe from a low hook in his bedroom. The timing of his death was, to say the least, extremely suspicious. The idea that the man who commanded Brazil's most secret military UFO investigation would end his own life just weeks after finally unburdening himself of his world-changing story struck many as too great a coincidence to be believed. His death immediately spawned persistent and troubling conspiracy theories. suggesting Hollanda had not committed suicide but had been silenced by shadowy figures within the military or intelligence agencies. The motive, according to this dark theory, was to prevent him from revealing even more secrets, or perhaps to send a chilling message to any other former members of Operation Saucer who might be contemplating speaking out. However, this narrative is complicated by more personal accounts. Ademar Gaverd, one of the ufologists who interviewed him, later stated that Hollanda had confided in him during the interview about a long and painful battle with depression. He had even attempted suicide once before, years earlier. This tragic fact makes the official verdict of suicide seem much more plausible. Another acquaintance suggested Hollanda's depression may have been exacerbated by a profound professional melancholy, a feeling of an unfulfilled mission related to the sudden termination of the most important investigation of his life. He had found something of monumental importance and had been ordered to bury it and never speak of it again. This terrible burden, which he carried in secret for 2 decades, may have simply become too heavy for him to bear. Regardless of the true cause, whether it was a final tragic victory for his personal demons or the final act of a government cover-up, Hollanda's sudden death cast a permanent, unsettling shadow over his powerful testimony. It added a final, tragic layer of mystery to the Colares puzzle. His confession now stands as his final word, a message sent from beyond the grave, a voice crying out from the heart of a great and disturbing mystery. The Colares incident presents us with a fascinating and terrifying paradox. On one hand, we have overwhelming, multi-layered evidence of a strange, hostile, and technologically advanced phenomenon witnessed by hundreds of civilians and officially confirmed by the military. On the other hand, we have an aggressive, absolute, and provably false denial from that very same military. To understand this paradox, we must take a final, critical look at our 3 theoretical frameworks. The psychosocial hypothesis, the idea that it was all in people's heads, is the one the official government denial implicitly favors. It's the easiest, cleanest explanation. It suggests the entire phenomenon was a textbook example of mass psychogenic illness. However, a careful analysis shows the Colares case fails to meet the scientific criteria for this explanation on several critical points. First, a typical case of mass psychogenic illness involves mild, temporary, and subjective symptoms like dizziness or headaches. In Colares, Dr. Carvalho documented objective, long-lasting, and severe physical damage. Skin that had dyed and turned black, significant hair loss, a dangerous drop in red blood cells, and at least 2 subsequent deaths. These are biological markers. They are not caused by panic, they require a real external physical agent, like a weapon or a radiation source. Second, a psychogenic event, by definition, lacks a real physical stimulus. The fact that the military, using professional equipment, took over 500 photographs and 16 hours of film of tangible objects serves as definitive proof of a real external object in the sky. The military's own secret data, therefore, is the strongest argument against the mass hysteria hypothesis. They photographed what the people were seeing. Third, the phenomenon was witnessed by a wide demographic: men, women, children, doctors, the mayor, across a vast geographical region. Most importantly, the military personnel themselves, trained and skeptical observers, also became primary witnesses. This proves the cause was something real that existed outside the minds of the villagers. The widespread panic was not a shared delusion. It was a logical reaction to a real and present threat. The terrestrial secrecy hypothesis, the idea of secret human technology, provides a compelling and logical explanation for the cover-up. This hypothesis suggests the luminous objects were advanced. Secret human technology, possibly non-lethal directed energy weapons or silent surveillance drones being tested by a foreign power, most likely the United States, during the Cold War. This framework makes perfect sense when viewing the government's behavior. First, it gives a clear motive for the investigation itself. Operation Saucer was launched not to find aliens, but in a desperate effort to identify what was illegally violating Brazilian airspace and harming its citizens. It was a national security investigation. Second, it provides a powerful motive for the intense secrecy and the cover-up. The official conclusion of no unusual phenomena becomes a clever act of strategic misinformation. It was far less embarrassing for the Brazilian military dictatorship to allow the world to believe its people were hysterical than to admit a massive and humiliating national security failure. That an unidentified, technologically superior foreign power was operating freely inside its borders, and they were utterly powerless to stop it. While this hypothesis struggles to account for the stranger aspects of the story, like Captain Hollanda's encounter with a humanoid being, or the apparent biological sampling of the Chupa Chupa attacks, it provides the most satisfying and evidence-based explanation for the government's intense secrecy and its dishonest denial. The extraterrestrial or interdimensional hypothesis, the idea of non-human visitors, aligns most neatly with all of the extraordinary data from the actual encounters. This hypothesis is supported by several hard-to-ignore observations. First is the clear technological supremacy of the objects. The performance of the UAPs, their silent flight, stable hovering, instantaneous right-angle acceleration, and reported transmedium capabilities remains far beyond the known public capabilities of any military technology in 1977 or even today. Second is the intelligent and almost clinical behavior they displayed. The slow, methodical, migrating pattern of sightings described by Captain Hollanda suggests an organized, systematic scouting mission. The physical attacks, while horrifying, have a strange clinical signature. The paired puncture marks, the anemia, the precise necrotic burns that Captain Hollanda himself interpreted as a form of biological sampling rather than random acts of violence. This aligns with theories of a detached, non-human scientific mission studying a less advanced species. Third is the powerful authority of the close encounter testimony. Captain Hollanda's personal story, carrying the full weight of his military authority, and his unwavering account of encountering a humanoid being, provides the most direct and powerful data supporting this hypothesis. You either believe the commander of the operation or you believe the official lie told after it was shut down. While it is based on an extraordinary premise that still lacks definitive proof, this is the one framework that aligns most closely with all of the reported evidence without ignoring key pieces of data. The attacks at Colares were disturbingly methodical, much like the process a biologist uses to study an insect. Imagine a biologist who finds a rare beetle. He doesn't smash it, he studies it with cold precision. First, he carefully traps it. The victims in Colares described a sudden paralysis, a force that held them completely still, unable to move or even scream. This is like the biologist gently pinning the insect to a board so it can be examined. Then the biologist inserts a thin, sharp needle to draw a sample. The beams of light were not wide and messy. They were focused, about 3 inches wide, and left behind tiny paired puncture marks in the center of the burns, as if a needle had been surgically inserted to extract something. The process was clinical, detached, and terrifyingly intelligent, not a random act of violence, but a systematic collection of biological data from a helpless subject. A dark rumor persists to this day, offering another explanation for the sudden shutdown and cover-up. Some researchers believe that Operation Saucer was not just terminated by the Brazilian government, but was shut down by outside forces. This theory suggests that the CIA learned of the Brazilian investigation, realized they were being filmed, and stepped in. They confiscated the most revealing of Hollanda's evidence, especially the film footage, and forced the Brazilian government into a cover-up. The real question here is why. How could the US, and more specifically the CIA, come into a foreign country, a dictatorship at that, and take evidence and get that government to cover it up? What if the Brazilian Air Force discovered something genuinely non-human, and the subsequent cover-up was not just to hide their powerlessness, but to prevent a global panic? The legacy of Colares is twofold. It is the haunting human story of a remote community, terrorized by a mysterious silent force that descended from their night sky. But it is also the meticulously documented story of a major, direct interaction between a national government and an unknown reality. An interaction deemed so significant, so potentially world-altering, that its truth was officially denied and systematically hidden from its own people and from the entire world. The enduring mystery of Colares is not simply what the lights were, but why the comprehensive, military-grade evidence of their existence, collected at great effort and personal cost by Captain Hollanda and his brave team, remains largely concealed from us to this day. The shadows over Colares have lifted, but the profound questions they left behind remain, hanging in the humid Amazonian air, still waiting for an answer. As we step back from the crossroads, remember, the story doesn't end here, because this is just the beginning. Searching for the knowledge and wisdom to unravel the mysteries of our universe. Unexplained sightings, spirits, and science. They are all connected in the grand tapestry of life. So remember, keep pulling at the threads, because this has been Crossroads of the Veil.